and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Lit Fest, Goa Arts Literary Festival. Today is a Sunday and most of us Goans are lazing around our beds. Around 1/10 of us must be heading out for Sunday Mass. And the heretics like me are here. So we are going to start off with a session called Writing Cities, Kathmandu, Delhi and Bombay. We have Thomas Bell and Sam Miller in conversation with Naresh Fernandes. That may give you the lowdown on distinguished guests. Thomas Bell, who was here for a session with Anis Ahmed earlier, the day before yesterday, I think, on the 5th. He was born in England in 1978 and studied at Oxford and Kurtaul Universities of Art. After university, he moved to Kathmandu to cover the civil war in Nepal for Daily Telegraph, Economist and other papers. He was a Southeast Asia correspondent of the Daily Telegraph before returning to Nepal, where he now lives with his family. Kathmandu, a non-fiction book about the city, is his first book. Sam Miller is the author of A Strange Kind of Paradise, India Through Foreign Eyes. Sam was born and brought up in London, studied history at Cambridge University and politics at SOAS before joining the BBC in 1986, for which he has worked on and off ever since. In the early 1990s, he was the BBC World Service TV and radio correspondent in Delhi. Later, he became the head of the Urdu service and subsequently managing editor for South Asia. He was posted back in Delhi in 2002 and has remained there since. He is the author of Delhi, Adventures in a Mega City and Blue Guide, India. So, Naresh Fernandes will be in conversation with them. He is the editor of Scroll.in, a digital daily, and an excellent one, I must say, because that's one which has crept into my thumbnails and is up there with the BBC Arts and Letters Daily and First Post and yes. He is the author of City Adrift, a short biography of Bombay and the Taj Mahal Foxtrot, the story of Bombay's jazz age. He lives and works in Bombay. He has written extensively and beautifully about Chris Berry, Lorna, all our favorite Goan company singers, much deeper than anybody in Goa has ever covered. So over to you, gentlemen.
Thanks. Well, good morning and thanks for being here on a lovely Sunday. We're lucky that they haven't put us on the lawn where we would also be sweaty, so that's more. As you know, we're here to talk about writing about cities, and over the past decade especially, there's been a great deal of interest in cities. Some of this is driven by the fact that the whole world is urbanizing. By 2050, there will be more urban people than village dwellers. This has completely altered the balance of how people live. And I'm reminded of that every time I come for this Lit Fest, and Panjam has crept even further down the Talegaon plateau. When we first began to come here maybe 5 years ago, that big building, Models, was already there, but now there are many more things. I can see there are shops creeping up the road, and it's something that you all in Goa know about, and experiencing the stresses and the joys of urbanization almost on a sort of day-to-day basis. And this is happening all over India and all over the world. I occasionally take trips to Pune from Bombay, and now it seems that all of Pune and Bombay is fusing into one big city. So Bombay creeps further out and Pune creeps down the road to meet Bombay. Soon they go to sort of shake hands, it seems. But everybody's also been writing about cities, and some of the most exciting literature in recent years has come out about the wonderful joys of living in cities, of people meeting random people unlike themselves, and how sometimes this results in enormous creative energies being let loose, and sometimes this results in great conflict. There's been Sumetu Mehta's Maximum City, Teju Cole, who's been a frequent guest at the festival, has written a lot about Lagos, especially in his new book. And these two gentlemen have written about South Asian cities, books that are much more familiar to us. And I'm going to ask them by reading passages from their books so we get a flavor of what they've been doing. So, Sam, will you start, please?
Yes. Can you hear me okay? Is this on?
Yes.
Yes, it is. Good. Lovely to see you. Sorry about the early start and drag so many of you, including me, out of bed. I really wanted to begin by reading something very specifically about cities in general, but it relates to the city that I wrote about and came to, as I put it, love and hate at the same time, partly because it was so enormous, so teeming. What Naresh says about Bombay and Pune, or about Punjab, absolutely in Delhi, there would be mustard fields one time, and then 3 months later, it's a construction site. A year later, it's a huge area of Delhi, and the speed of change has been really, really quite astonishing. My introduction to Delhi is in 1989, the first time I came there. I had fallen for a woman from Bombay, and my first experience and my first love, in a sense, was Bombay, as I still call it, remembering those old days there. But on that first visit to Delhi, I had just come bedazzled from Calcutta, where I had traipsed the streets, paddling through late monsoon rains. I had also by then grown to love Bombay, almost as quickly as I had grown to love a Bombay woman, and had begun to contemplate the possibility of living there amidst the slums and penthouses, as close to the sea as possible. Both those cities, Delhi's significant others, seem to have an energy and an identity which I did not sense in Delhi. Everyone in Delhi seemed irritable. They weren't so interested in me, I felt. And there was no clear centre, no heart to the city. I couldn't orient myself in it. I even once, to my present-day shame, described it to a friend as loathsome. I later went on to live and work as a journalist in Delhi for 2.5 years in the early 90s. I would leave Delhi at every opportunity and go back to my wife's home city of Bombay, or to anywhere in the subcontinent that wasn't Delhi. When asked, I would describe Delhi as provincial and mean-spirited and matlabi, a word which, as I think most of you will know, has the implication that people make friends only because of their ability to assist in climbing a particular social or career ladder. Some of that was, and it is still true, but it was also, as I now realise, a partial and incomplete account of a dizzyingly complex city undergoing rapid and unpredictable change. Delhi's population has more than doubled in the time I have known it. It has become, for better and for worse, a world city. It has everything that is old and everything that is modern. It still has its majestic, scattered ruins that, for me, equal those of Rome or Athens or Cairo. But it has largely lost the parochial quality I remember from the 1990s. Today, Delhi makes the city of my birth, London, feel quiet and peripheral. Delhi has a sense of continuous decay and regeneration that I've not met elsewhere. I find myself preaching to anyone who will listen that the world ignores Delhi's experiments with modernity at its peril. And this is my sermon, in a sense, what I feel we need to think about cities, whether they're smaller cities or larger cities. Sometimes, because those large cities are so large, and they can make us feel so small as individuals, we lose hope about changing anything. We forget that we human beings have created these cities, these monsters. They are entirely our responsibility. And so in the end, my sermon continues, they are entirely our responsibility. We will collectively get the cities we deserve. For that reason, we must come to believe that our great cities needn't be hell on earth, that they might even become better than purgatory. The world's urban pasts are brimming with failures, a world in which Delhi is an incubator for an uncertain urban future. As for me personally, only now am I beginning to come to terms with this vacillating attraction and repulsion that I feel for this monstrous, addictive city. Delhi has drawn me back repeatedly, a magnet and a temptation, and I tread its streets like a man possessed. Now, this is, in a sense, the beginning, the introduction to a wander, a walk through Delhi, where I tell the story of the modern city through my eyes and through the people I meet. And I suppose I'm endlessly aghast at what I saw. I meet people and have wonderful stories from them wherever I go, that in some sense, different senses throw light on this city. I don't go on about how much I love it. I think I loved being in it. This book came out about 4 or 5 years ago, and things have moved on a pace since then. But I just recently returned to London, and I began trying to do something similar to this. And people do not interact with each other in the same way that they do, I think, in all South Asian cities, but particularly Delhi, whereby I try and speak to people on the streets, and they would look at me in London as if I was mad. Here in, and I think it's true in Punjab as well, I went for a sort of walk at 11 o'clock last night, and people were very friendly and helpful and so on. And there's a sense of which people are happy to exchange stories. And I think cities are really, for me, about stories and places where people can meet and connect. There's not enough of that in a lot of places. That the poor and the rich, certainly in the old days in Delhi, often didn't meet. It's very important that they do.
John, can you give us a sense of what your books about?
Sure. I wish I had a copy here which I could wave around in front of you. They haven't arrived. So I'll read it from my computer. The book has passages in it which describe the city in all manner of different ways. For example, with regard to its architecture, its architectural development, its physical development, and it's kind of organized from the inside out, and from its beginnings up to the current day. Those are some of the ways in which the book's organized, and in due course it comes to describe some of the modern ways in which it's organized, including its economy and power structures. And the passage which I'm going to read, this is right.
Yeah.
The passage which I'm going to read describes the development industry in Nepal, or partly describes the development industry in Nepal, which is one of the most important and prominent economic activities which go on there. It rather dominates upper middle class incomes, I suppose. It's one of the most sought after sectors in which to work, and it's highly visible in Kathmandu, if not in the rest of the country necessarily, where the benefits are intended to be felt or pretended to be felt. So this passage describes how this industry has developed over the years. The Nepali Development Laboratory was inaugurated by the Americans' Community Development Concept in 1951, which was implemented through their village development projects. They regarded Nepal as a blank slate. The notion of awakening villagers to improve themselves apparently owed something to the self-help manuals of the time. The first 5-year plan was launched in 1956, designed by a UN expert and 3/4 funded by American, Indian, Chinese and Russian contributions. Foreign money built the rapidly expanding bureaucracy. Foreign aid contribution as a percentage of GDP blossomed during the Panchayat years, which actually explained was the name of the regime between 1960 and 1990. Multilateral donors and lenders such as the UN, World Bank and Asian Development Bank joined the scene, and new bilaterals such as the Japanese, Germans and British joined the Indian, Swiss and US. In the 60s, capital investment would let Nepal take off. Poverty eradication was the mantra in the 70s, but less for any reason specific to Nepal than inconsistency with global currents, such as renewed concern at the spread of communism in peasant societies. There would be growth with equity and the basic needs approach, and integrated rural development projects, not unlike the old village development projects, except this time they were integrated. The projects had little benefit, of course, for reasons including that powerful people ate the cash. By the 80s, new old ideas were going around again, like community empowerment and participation. Development workers were change agents, working with communities and to form users groups, or to teach villagers that they'd asked for the projects that were about to be given to them. The 80s and early 90s also brought structural adjustment, which was being pushed everywhere by the World Bank and IMF to create growth through privatization and liberalization. The benefits would trickle down. As it turned out, the anticipated results didn't materialize. The benefits were captured by a few, and rural incomes went into absolute decline. The Cold War ended and the 1990 People's Movement happened. Donors that had supported the monarchy supported democracy instead. A 1992 US aid publication, marking the anniversary of 4 decades of development the previous year, reckoned that with the changed political circumstances of the past few years and an increased understanding of the need to follow market principles and to rely on the private sector to stimulate economic growth, we're hopeful that by the year 2001, the 50th anniversary of Nepal's entry into the modern era, we will see Nepal graduate from the ranks of the world's relatively least developed countries. By now, there were 32 bilateral and multilateral donors, but the poor were still there in increased numbers. GDP per capita hovered around 2%, and GDP growth per capita hovered around 2%, and economic inequality was widening. 4 years later, a journalist wrote, "The powerful aid givers, all strong believers in the trickle-down theory, are of the belief that when the dust settles, the public as a whole will benefit. More likely, we will have a revolt on our hands. But by then, of course, the aid agencies will be on to the fad of the next half-decade, which will in all probability be, and not at all incongruously, the rediscovery of the role of government in national development." So it proved. Structural adjustment didn't cause the Maoist insurgency, but as those words were written, the first shots of the war were being fired in the Western Hills. Rural poverty and discrimination, failed development and dysfunctional state institutions helped to incubate an uprising that would exceed all expectations. Between 1997 and 1996, the number of Nepali people in absolute poverty had nearly doubled, and it goes on. To me, I mean, this is a chapter which is ruffled a lot of feathers in Kathmandu. Actually, it gained a lot of attention, and it's become a talking point. Chapter 22 is number 22, and the entire international community in Nepal, which is quite large, is all saying, "How can you say that? And is it true?" And inviting me around to dinner to say, "Is it really so bad?" And I'm afraid it is.
So I wanted to ask the both of you. You could have chosen to write books on any number of subjects. Why did you choose to write a book about Kathmandu?
Well, because it was where I lived, and had lived for some time by that stage, so it was a subject that was under my nose. I mean, I wanted to write a book about Nepal, and although not exclusively, my interests tended towards sort of historical and political subjects and what those mean for Nepal's current condition and Nepal's contemporary politics. So in a way, writing about the city of Kathmandu was a device to explore those subjects because it's an ancient capital. It's the capital of at least until now, a highly centralized unitary state. So the history of the capital can be made to stand without too much twisting, and I certainly hope I haven't done any twisting, for the country as a whole. And it's only to a limited extent, and in recent years, really, I suggest that the rest of the country has begun to impinge on the capital, until then the capital kind of merrily ignored the rest of the country. So you can describe the story of how Nepal got to its current condition by using that city as a kind of a narrative device, I suppose.
What makes Kathmandu unique? Why did you choose Kathmandu out of all of the other cities perhaps that could have told the story, or the devices that could have told the story?
Well, I think it's partly because I've always been interested in cities, and I have some background in my time as a student in studying the history of architecture. So it's physical development and it's buildings and things, and it's how a city works as an organism was something which also interested me. And I thought about that a great deal while I was organizing the book and structuring the book, about the way in which in a city everything's connected. And I tried to simulate that in the structure of the book. I gave quite a lot of attention to the development of the buildings and the way Kathmandu originated, for example, as a group of villages which are fused together and spread out. So I used this pattern to describe the development of the place and structure the book around it. I was interested by those kind of ideas too.
Sam, Why Delhi?
Well, I suppose Delhi was definitely, sorry, Delhi was definitely not my first love, even in India. I wrote a long piece, sort of 5,000 worder on Calcutta. I'd done a radio program about Calcutta, and I traveled there a lot in the late 80s, early 90s. I'd explored Bombay. I did a long, mad walk one time in several stages from Bayanda down to Nariman Point, and then got stuck with the docks and the Navy area where suddenly you were stopped from walking. And I did think about writing some of that up. I'm a walker. I love walking in cities. I've always done that. Delhi was my home. I returned to it in 2003, still with this burden of disliking this place. And I just set out to explore it and see whether I was wrong, see how much it could change. I was very keen to try and get a sense, to try and capture change. The speed at which Delhi was changing at that time was astonishing. And I didn't actually think that was true of Bombay or Calcutta, then or now. The rapidity. You know, Delhi in the early 90s was, you know, we used to joke about there's no culture in Delhi, only agriculture. That it's a sort of two-horse town. You know, it used to be very scathing, and then suddenly, sort of writers and artists and designers start moving there. It becomes a strangely buzzy place, but it hasn't lost any of the sort of terrible government-related, matlabi type stuff, the sort of retirement home for bureaucrats aspect to it. It's still full of foreign diplomats, but they're dwarfed by something else that's happened, that's partly migrants from the rest of India, rich and poor. And I think I became fascinated, I became obsessed by the city during this time. And felt I needed to almost record the speed of change in a place. And a lot of it is that. It can be about returning to a place, as I said earlier, 6 months later, and it's unrecognizable. I don't really feel that about Bombay. I mean, there are bits, obviously. I was in the Banjakula complex recently, and obviously that wasn't there when I first went. And the sea link has finally been built there. I don't know Punjab well enough to know how much and what kind of speed of change you're dealing with here. But it's something to keep in mind, record, and care about. And if you're born out and brought up in a particular place, or are there for any stretch of time, try and recall what shop was there before they built that high-rise building. Try and track its recent history. And history isn't just about great buildings and ancient architecture and so on. It's about recent history. It's about the memory, your memories, and the memories of your parents and grandparents. And those are the kinds of things that have always interested me. Just talking to people. How's it changed? What's happened? What was there before this building was there? Was it fields? The area I lived in Delhi, which now feels like it's in the middle of Delhi, in the 1950s was farmland. And I remember meeting the first people who moved in there, in houses that now cost crores and crores of rupees. They were, and in the late 60s, they couldn't sell the land off. People thought they were mad to live so far outside Delhi. Now it's deep within Delhi.
Which part of Delhi is
This is Panchil Park. You know, if anyone who knows Delhi, it's right in the middle of Delhi, or South Delhi, sir. But you talk to people who remember it in the 60s, and it kind of almost went bust, and then someone got their family members to buy lots of plots at knockdown prices, and, you know, many crores for houses. There's one I know that's gone for 18 crores. And I don't know what the original
That's the one you brought with your book, right?
Sadly not. Sadly not. No, Delhi, you know, if anyone knows Delhi, Delhi's property market is absolutely and it's part of the story of
Sam, how do you go about developing a memory? How do you go around getting under the skin of the city in which you haven't grown up?
talking to people really, and talking to everyone. I was sort of trying to improve my Hindi anyway, so it's a great way of improving one's language skills. It's very easy in Delhi to live a sort of air-conditioned life, but I've always loved just being outside and chatting to people and asking them questions. I'm an old hack, I'm a journalist really, and I've done a lot of training with journalists, and one of the things that we always said to sort of young journalists is there are at least 2 stories down every street. And sometimes we'd literally, they'd come in on day 1 of the training course, and we'd say, go out and find them. And they'd be terrified because they're used to having a press release. They used to be being told, there's this political story, now follow it up. But actually, for me, that's not what journalism is about. It's about going out there and finding a story. And it was almost like I'd been saying this, sitting in air-conditioned rooms, saying all this for years. And now it was about the kind of proof of the pudding, and getting out there and actually seeing whether you can do it. Frankly, in Delhi, it's incredibly easy. The stories jump at you, they fly at you. There are so many out there that are wonderful. As I was saying earlier, in London, I'm finding it much, much harder because people are just not willing to talk. Unless you've got a sort of reason or an introduction to them.
In your particular method, which is walking around cities, and Delhi specifically, I imagine there are 2 problems. One is it's bloody hot most of the time. It goes to 50 degrees, so that was limited your research period. But the other thing is Delhi is a strangely circular city. How do you go about navigating a city like this and sort of making sure you go through all of its parts?
I mean, with the heat, in the summer I would just go out there early, which is what everyone else did as well. So, you know, actually being out at midday, I was occasionally in the summer, but no one else is really. They're all hiding away, so you don't get the story. So go out there early, or go out at night. With Delhi, I chose a pattern which was a spiral. So I began in common place in the middle and slowly went further and further out. And that gave me a template, a rough template for my walk. But more importantly, it kind of cut across the traditional areas of Delhi. It sort of forced me into, frankly, what were slum areas, which I wouldn't otherwise have gone on. If you just go along the arterial roads, for instance, in Delhi, you don't really see that. You don't see how people live. You don't see the most interesting streets. Actually, in Bombay, it's less so. You do see you do see Bombay on sort of from your car, or still not really. The best way of doing it is still to get out on foot. But that was what I took, and this spiral, and it gradually got further and actually was that way round and crossed the river, and then I ended up in Gurgaon, which I'm not very nice about, but a lot of people laugh, and it's the future.
Tom, how did you go about researching your book?
Well, I also use a lot of, I'm also a journalist or a former journalist, so I use quite a lot of journalistic methods, interviews and so on. Not with just people I met on the street by and large, but I had various topics I wanted to research. I sought people out who, you know, and interviewed them. So there was that. There was a great deal of reading. I mean, one of the organizing principles of the book is that I wanted to include as many documents from as many different periods of Kathmandu's past as possible, and to quote them in reasonably sized chunks, you know, a paragraph or so at a time, because I thought that as much as the buildings of the city are its fabric, so are these stories and this history, and these are its written monuments. So So I put them in there to try to create as much texture, to try to add that texture at least. I included photographs, as Sam did too. I wanted to make it feel as sort of densely textured and alike to a city as possible, and to simulate this way in which everything's connected, and in which everything. I mean, I think one of the ways in which you experience a city, especially experience discovering a city which you come to for the first time as an adult, is that different things crop up in different contexts, right? The better you know it, the more repeatedly you encounter the same thing in a different way. And I tried to reflect that in the book without, I mean, of course the great pitfall there is that then it actually appears repetitive and the reader's thinking, you said that already, what's he talking about? So I tried to simulate that kind of experience of repetition without appearing repetitive.
When was the first time you went to Kathmandu? Tell us about your first impressions of this city.
I first went there in 2002. And I think one of my very first impressions, I haven't told this story before, it's a short one. On the first evening in the city, I saw all these men pissing in the streets, and I thought, this is a place where I can feel at home. This is relaxing. I was immediately struck by the beauty of the old buildings. I was fortunate. I moved to an older neighborhood of the city. A friend had given me an address. I said, go and ask this guy if he can rent a room, which I did. And it was in one of the oldest parts of the city, a very beautiful and interesting, intricate kind of neighborhood, full of old buildings, which are also being torn down and replaced. So I was very kind of impressed and kind of moved and fascinated by this process of change. Greatly struck by the architecture. And there's a great deal of festivals, I mean, almost daily festivals, people say. It's probably no exaggeration. So, and all of this kind of life was going on around me too. So I was enchanted by all of that kind of thing from the get-go.
We have probably 7 minutes left now, so let's throw it up to the audience and put your hand up and please ask a question rather than making a statement. Mustansi, I know you have things to ask.
Yes, I'm interested in this business of fast change which is transforming all our cities, and I'm from Bombay, and you can see that as an almost mutation, rather than the normal development of cities. And you're talking about Delhi and Kathmandu. I wonder if you see this kind of fast change coming in these cities and what influence it has.
Mustansi teaches architecture at the JJ College. And you're right, it's almost as if these cities have been transformed into things that have nothing to do sometimes with their historical past. Right?
Indeed, in the case of Kathmandu, this transformation has been extremely rapid. I think reinforced concrete became cheaper than traditional building materials of brick and timber in the mid-80s. And it's from around that period that there's been a huge explosion of modern, these pillar system houses all over the valley, taking up the valleys are kind of a basin, and whereas previously Kathmandu was really rather a small town, it's now a sprawling conurbation, and this has happened in the space of just a couple of decades. So the physical transformation has been extremely rapid. It came very late. So the place was extremely well preserved, as it had been for several hundred years, until say sort of the 60s or so, when this pace of change began to pick up a little. So after being so stable in certain respects for so long, it was then transformed in the living memory of an adult. So the physical changes are profound. The social and political changes which they're associated with are also very deep. But having come so recently, I think it's my impression that the old city still lives on in the memory of its original inhabitants, at least. I mean, not the migrants, of course, but those who live there. So you might say that the changes, in a sense, remain superficial. It's a work in progress, and it's extremely dramatic, and it's one of the things which attracted me to the subject.
Shall I? Yeah. In Delhi particularly, it became a very complicated planning issue because the local government behaved, and its official plans continued to treat Delhi as a city of 7 million, by which time it had actually reached 15 million. So there was this bizarre situation where they continued to make plans for it as if it was 7 million and it was 15 million. There was a kind of fundamental reality problem there. And some of that was about nostalgia. It was about longing for a city that had actually gone. It had gone quite a long time ago. And by not being realistic about it, we lost a huge amount. There was a sense in which certain old buildings had to be retained, the sort of top 10 or top 20. But beyond that, there wasn't. And what wasn't done is trying to work out ways in which the architectural heritage of Delhi, and I think this is true of other big cities, could be seen as useful and important to the local residents, and not just as something that outsiders tell them is beautiful and good. Because that, in an enormous city, doesn't work. You will find old buildings being used for stone. They'll take away the stone in the middle of the night, or people will move into these old buildings and ruin them. So we need realism if we're about these cities and how rapidly they're going to continue to grow. If we're actually going to have a piece with our architectural past. And Delhi is so full of, material that goes back to the 11th century. Every century is represented there. But I think it's certainly a struggle for Calcutta, and I think it is for Bombay. And we lose a lot all the time because we're not realistic about the pressures that the city is facing. And if we're not, we'll lose it.
Are you planning to write anything about Goa and how fast it is? It's been spoiled and it's really gone to the dogs, as one would say. Being a Goan myself and living in Goa, I see the vast changes from the 50s, 60s and what it is today. You could walk in the streets. I could walk from Margam to Benauli. Now you can't walk anywhere.
Yes, I would love to. It's true. But I don't know this place. This is my second day here after 5 or 6 years away. I've been here on holiday. I've never lived here, so I don't really feel I know it. But I've read quite a lot of the history. I'm very intrigued by it. I think it's a place that's been misrepresented, certainly in sort of how the rest of the world looks at Goa, and I'm very interested in its story. So it's sort of very early days at the moment, but yeah, I want to meet people. I always want to meet people and hear their stories, and that might make something. So I'm very interested, I want to say. But yes, possibly.
John, what are you working on now?
Well, I haven't started working on anything yet. I'm looking around. I'm on the lookout for a new idea.
Well, thanks everybody. We're right out of time. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.